right, so the the lyrics to this is, God is in all and yet beyond it all. Consciousness pervades all because God's nature is consciousness. God dwells in the living and in the non-living things as well. God is in all and yet beyond all. God dwells in all beings as spirit, all pervading. Absolute existence and consciousness and bliss have become all this, the creator and creation. So, and some of the words repeat over and over. So, Sahatu Sahano Gunatu Sahaviram Karavahai Tejasvinavaditamas Avidishavahai Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. So our topic is God and nature, or it could have been God in nature, or the relationship between God and nature. It could have been called all sorts of things. This idea of what the relationship between God and nature is has been asked for centuries, probably more than 3,000 years. First of all, people ask, is there a God? And if so, did God create nature? And if so, out of what did God create nature? Or if not, is God nature? Or is God in nature and beyond nature? And of course, closely related to these questions is the nature of consciousness or mind, which is the expression of consciousness that we are most familiar with and yet still baffled by. And then if the questions come, is consciousness an emergent process from matter, or is consciousness or mind separate from matter? And if so, how do they interact? Or is consciousness fundamental to existence? But the lyrics to the song that were based on Sri Ramakrishna's teaching kind of sums it up. But the Vedanta view is that God is all and transcends all. He's in all living beings and in the non-living as well. So that's the Vedanta answer. But we're going to explore a little bit about how the thoughts about God and nature have been developed through the millennia. Perhaps one could go back as far as the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who was often dubbed the first monotheist. He replaced all the deities of the Egyptian pantheon with the sun god Aten, and he wrote a hymn to the sun god, and a couple of verses from that hymn go like this: Thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou wert alone, all people, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth, going upon its feet, and whatever is on high, flying with its wings. Those on earth come from your hand as you made them. When you have dawned, they live. When you set, they die. You yourself are lifetime. One lives by you. All eyes are on your beauty until you set. All. This was a God that is intimately involved in the world, and everything that's alive is dependent on this sun God. And of course, the Upanishads, which are probably just as early as the Egyptian idea, in the Katha Upanishad, we find that being who is the power of all powers and is born as such, who embodies himself in the elements and in them exists, and who has entered the lotus of the heart, is the immortal self. So again, this is notice that it's embodying the elements that would, earth, fire, water, etc. So that's all of nature. Agni, the all-seeing who lies hidden in fire sticks, like a child well guarded in the womb, who is worshipped day by awakened souls and by those who offer oblations in sacrificial fire. He is the immortal self, that in which the sun rises and which it sets, that which is the source of all the power of nature and of the senses, that which nothing can transcend. That is the immortal self. What is within us is also without. What is without is also within. He who sees difference between that, between what is within and what is without, goes evermore from death to death. So again, this is emphasizing that this immortal self, which is of course one with Brahman, Atman and Brahman are one, is that which is all of these deities that were worshipped at that time, like Agni and so forth. And it's in the sun, and it's in all the nature of the senses. Now, the Greek philosophers, of course, also talked about these things. Plotinus, who was perhaps first Neoplatonist, had a metaphysics which called upon the one, or that equivalent to that, the good. And then he had two other principles, the intellect and the soul. And these principles are both ultimate ontological realities and explanatory principles. Plotinus believed that they were recognized by the great Plato as such, and so he based his tradition on that. So he had three ultimate principles. We usually think of dualists as having two. Well, he had three. But he was quite influential. The one is the absolute simple first principle of all, he says. It is both self-caused and the cause of being for everything else in the universe. So basically, he's a monist as well, because everything's going to come from this one principle. So, but he then gets these other two basic principles from that. Now, as we go down through the list of philosophers over the centuries, we find a perplexing array of philosophical terms to describe the slight nuances between one person's position and another. It seems like each one wants to give a uniqueness to their particular philosophy, and so they coined a new word. For example, pantheism is kind of the most fundamental one, and pantheism says that the universe is conceived of as a whole, and that whole is God, and conversely that there is no God but the combined substance, forces, and laws that are manifest in the existing universe. Now, this of course differs from Vedanta in that Vedanta recognizes both the transcendent and the immanent aspect of God. Pantheism emphasizes simply the immanent aspect and says that that's it. What you see is what you get, kind of thing. Then, another slight nuance, we have panentheism. Panentheism asserts that God includes the universe as a part, though not the whole of his being. So that leaves a little room for this transcendent aspect. One prominent philosopher named Spinoza, who has been made somewhat more popular lately because Einstein said that if he believed in a God, it would be the God of Spinoza. Spinoza believed in a monistic philosophy, a oneness, which posits that there's only one fundamental substance in existence. And according to him, this singular substance is God. Everything else, whether human beings, animals, or inanimate objects, is merely a mode of this divine substance. So many people would say that he is a panentheist, but other people label him as a pantheist. So who knows what he would have said? These terms actually come later than all these philosophies. Spinoza went on to say that God is perfection and human beings are imperfect. So while God encompasses all existence, humans are limited and finite. Now, of course, again, Vedanta would differ because we equate Brahman and Atman, not us physical human beings with a body and a mind, the mortal self, but the immortal Atman is one. All right, so brace yourself. There's another term. How about panpsychism? We like the word pan, meaning all here. Panpsychism is a philosophical view that posits that all things possess a mind or a mind-like quality. This term was coined by the Italian philosopher Pazzini in the 16th century. So it essentially suggests that consciousness or mental properties are fundamental and ubiquitous features of reality. Now, I agree to that to a certain extent, except that I wouldn't call it mind qualities. I'd simply call it a fundamental consciousness or a sentiency or an ability to respond to energies. And we'll get more into that later. And the terms just go on and on. There's pan-experientialism, and there's microphenomenalism, as opposed to macrophenomenalism, and pan-cognitivism. And so there's constitutive panpsychism and non-constitutive panpsychism, and pan-protopsychism, and microcosmopsychism, and cosmopsychism, each one having just a slightly different take on the problem of how we relate the mind or our consciousness with nature and with the ultimate reality. So my view is, of course, that Brahman is this ground of existence, the ground of all being, consciousness, existence, and bliss. And Brahman, of course, has the power to manifest the universe, which is something like a magic show in that this universe fools us into perceiving a physical universe as separate from Brahman and separate from us. We see us and we see an objective world out there. And of course, this power is called Maya. And again, I think consciousness can be more broadly thought of as some sort of sentiency when you get down to more fundamental levels of consciousness. The trouble is when you think of consciousness, you think of I'm a conscious being. And so you think, well, if you're talking about consciousness, you mean things like me, things that are conscious like I am conscious. And that's not really the idea here. It's more of a fundamental consciousness that's a sentiency, an ability to respond to and sense energies, an ability to interact in this universe. Now, how does this sentiency and energy in this universe come about? I think it's because we are basically misperceiving Brahman through Maya. And because of that misperception, this energy exists in the universe. Now, we know from Einstein that energy and matter are one. So energy and matter is the whole ball of wax. That's all of nature. That's all of Maya. It's all the apparent universe. And we see this universe as manifesting as matter and energy because there's this tension created. When you misperceive the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality for the finite, divided, and changing, then there's this tension that there's something a little miss. How do I get back to the real source of things? How do I understand the real nature of what it is that I'm perceiving, the real nature of this world? And so this tension, or you could say anthropomorphically, a yearning to manifest the true nature of the universe or of ourselves is the energy we see in the universe that manifests as an energy to try to get back to the ultimate reality. And so nature is really a reflection, you could say, of Brahman. And so the true nature of Brahman is reflected in the nature of the world. The nature of Brahman is hidden within it, as we saw in the Egyptian poem and in the Upanishadic verse. So, really, I think the idea here is to try to find that revealing aspect of nature. It's often described that this Maya is made up of three gunas, or three qualities, and one of those is sattva, and sattva is a revealing aspect. And so even though Maya is like a magic show that's not giving us the true picture, it also reveals something about the true nature behind it. So now let's go back to the real nitty-gritty, which would answer some of these philosophers' questions if they would only study Vedanta a little bit. There is really a sentiency all the way back. This would be your pan-micropsychism. There's a consciousness all the way down into the subatomic particles, electrons and protons. Electrons and protons are perfectly aware of and respond to things like gravity, electricity, and magnetism. Every atom in the world made up of electrons and protons and neutrons knows about the rest of the matter of the universe due to the force of gravity. And the electrical charged particles know all about the other electrical charged particles. The like particles repel each other, and the unlike charged particles attract each other. And when you move a charged particle, you get a magnetic field, and so the electrically charged particles also sense magnetic fields. So all of these energies are sensed by electrons and protons. So that's what I mean by a sentiency, a basic sentiency, a micro-panpsychism, if you like that term. And so nature builds up from that. It can't help it. Every molecule is also sentient because it's made up of sentient atoms, sentient electrons and protons. And how do we see a drive towards this unification back to Brahman in the formation of molecules? Well, when a molecule forms, it forms a substance that has a lower energy state than the original constituencies. That's why chemical reactions happen. When you study chemistry, if you can remember that far back, you remember that reactions happen when the energy embedded in the products is less than the energy of the things that went into the reaction. And so it's this reduction of energy that's a seeking of the original. You see, if energy is created because of the mistake of the separation and perceiving the multiplicity, any reduction of energy is a drive towards that, back to that ultimate oneness. So from this point of view, we can see that everything in the universe is striving to get back to that original oneness. Then we get this quantum leap into living organisms. And living organisms are qualitatively different from non-living organisms. Even though there's a basic sentiency in the non-living, just as the song said at the beginning, God is in the living and the non-living. There's something qualitatively different about it, because we all know that when an organism dies, whether it's a plant or an animal, it no longer is living. It no longer has the ability to take in energy from the environment and organize itself into living cells. Even though all the molecular constituencies of the cells are still there, intact, the organism is no longer operating. And so there's something qualitatively different. And that is really one of the great mysteries. We really don't know how that difference takes place. But from a religious standpoint, it's just another quantum leap up to the greater sentiency. And so all of these living things have a greater sentiency than just electrons, protons, and atoms and molecules. And so they are now striving in the world of nature, again, to get back to their original nature, which is to be one with the ultimate reality. And so we would expect to see some level of consciousness in all living things. And indeed we do. We find that living organisms know how to seek out the energy sources that sustain their life. And so they are sentient about their environment, and they have the ability to respond to changes in their environment. So we know that through evolution, organisms are able to adapt to new situations which arise in the environment. And this has been happening for billions and billions of years. For the more than 3 billion years that living organisms have been on this planet, they have had to adapt to everything from a very hot environment to a snowball Earth environment, which has gone back and forth. We've had a couple of snowball Earth events, and then it warms up again. And sometimes it gets a lot warmer than it is now. Sometimes it gets a lot colder than it is now. We are in a Goldilocks period. If you look at the geological history of the Earth, it doesn't stay in this position very long. It's not a very stable equilibrium. When things get cold, they tend to get colder. And when they get hot, they tend to get hotter. And staying in this middle range is not easy. And global engineering is probably going to have to be the wave of the future if we want to continue to exist in any kind of fashion that's similar to what we are doing now. We're going to have to learn to globally engineer things to keep this rather unstable equilibrium. What we see is that plants have consciousness. You can hook plants up to a polygraph, that's like a lie detector machine, and you can threaten them with things, or you can talk nicely to them, and you can see different responses to them. And we also know that plants interact with each other. There's a fungal network in the soil which helps plants communicate with each other. And so not only does an individual plant have consciousness, but there's a collective consciousness to the whole plant kingdom. And there's all sorts of symbiotic relationships between the different kingdoms, like the fungus kingdom and the plant kingdom. And of course, lichens are a fantastic example. They combine a fungus and a bacteria and an algae all together in a symbiotic relationship, and each one contributes something to the survival of the others. And so plants and other kinds of living organisms have learned how to get along with each other, how to compete with others. They also know how to do that. Vines will grow up on a plant and smother it out, use it as a nice support, and then deprive the original plant of its life-giving sun. So it's a plant world out there. The plants sometimes competing with each other. We see this, both cooperation and competition, all the way up through the natural world, it seems. And then, of course, animals. We see that animals seem to have a consciousness. You know, it's interesting. Some philosophers, like Descartes is a classic example. He thought all animals were just automatons. And in those days, they had sophisticated mechanical things with springs and stuff that would act out little mechanical animals, and they had these in the park. And he thought all animals were like that. They were just a little more sophisticated than the ones people were making. One philosopher that was talking about that said, clearly Descartes did not have pets. I would agree with that. You can't raise, say, a litter of kittens or a litter of dogs and think that they're all automatons, that they're all kind of just cut out of the same mold. So it's interesting that several religious traditions grappling with this, there'll be sections of those religious traditions that accept God is nature, or that there's a divinity to nature, and others that emphasize that God is not nature, and nature is not God. And this, of course, this dilemma is again illustrated nicely in Vedanta when we say that Maya is neither real nor unreal. You can't really put it in either of those baskets. If you look at it from one perspective, it's real. If you look at it from another perspective, it's not real. From the perspective that everything has to come from Brahman, it has to be real. But from the standpoint that it's not giving us the correct picture, you could say it's an unreal picture anyway. We, of course, find this in Christianity and Hinduism and many other religions as well. The predominant Christian view for many millennium was that nature was kind of evil. You know, it was back to Adam and Eve, and they were tempted into knowing about things in the natural world, and that threw them out of the garden. And so evil nature is what keeps us from knowing God and so forth. And so people have a negative impression about nature. And then there was this idea that human beings had a dominance over nature and that they could do pretty much what they wanted to. So this led to kind of an unhealthy viewpoint on nature. But there are still other Christians and Christian mystics going back a long ways that held that nature was sacred and that God was revealed through nature, that nature is a divine manifestation and a sign of God's glory. And you find the same thing in Hinduism. You can find some Advaita Vedantists that emphasize so much the unreality of the world that they just ignore nature. Nature is something, again, that's distracting. We're distracted by our senses looking at nature, and because we're distracted by our senses, we don't look within and find our true nature. Now, it's interesting that we find that mystics are also somewhat divided on this topic. We have many different types of mysticism. And broadly speaking, you could say that they are introverted mystics and extroverted mystics. The introverted mystics are the ones we hear most about in our tradition, I think. It's the emphasis on going within, meditating within, finding that divinity, that Atman shining within your heart. And that leads to mystical experiences of the introverted type, where you become one with the divine and the dualities disappear. But there are also other kinds of mysticism that you could call extroverted mysticism, where you don't lose the vision, you could say, or the reality of the external world, but you see it differently. You see it as a manifestation of divinity. Now, again, we're so blessed. Ramakrishna exhibited both of those kinds of mysticism, as he covered all the bases in so many ways. He did so in this as well. Perhaps you remember the story that someone walked over the lawn and he felt actual pain and marks on his body. He was so identified with the whole living cosmos. He went into samadhi that was triggered by seeing white cranes against the backdrop of dark clouds in the sky. So that's definitely a mystical nature experience. Nature triggered this mystical experience for him. And of course, is going into samadhi all the time, nirvikalpa samadhi, where all distinctions are lost and you are one with the ultimate reality. he did that all the time. So he exhibited both of those. And Vivekananda also really included both of those views as well. He wrote a poem called In Nature's Beauty. Did I actually find that here? I can't remember now. I don't think so. And I can read it to you if I haven't found it. Nature's Beauty. Majestic morn, the melting eve, the boundless billowy sea. In nature's beauty, songs of birds, I see through them, it is he. So you see, we're seeing God in nature here. The moon's soft light, the sky so bright, the glorious orb of day. He shines in them, his beauty might, reflected lights are they. So he's mighty, and the nature is a reflected beauty. When dire calamity seizes me, the heart seems weak and faint. Meseems I hear the whispering sweet, my love, I am near, I am near. When nature seems to crush me down with laws that never bend, with thee, my love, my heart gets strong, 1,000 deaths no fear. Where'er I roam from this day forth, may I feel God standing by. O'er hill and dale, high mount and vale, far, far away and high. So he's including, again, both of these ideas, that we can see God in nature, and we can also realize that he is mighty and transcends nature as well. One time, one of his disciples was commenting about the beauty of the sunset and how beautiful the nature was, and he said, when you contemplate the beauty of nature, realize how much more beautiful the Creator is. And so again, he recognized the beauty of nature, but he also emphasized that the beauty of the Creator is even greater. So there are other people that make even more distinguishing things about different kinds of mysticism. I think I'll skip that for now. But just a couple of other examples. Hildegard of Bingen, who is a 12th century Christian mystic, so just so we get the idea that not all Christians degraded nature and thought it was evil and horrible. This 12th century Christian mystic was an ecological thinker. She understood the universe as an entity, each part penetrated by the essence of the whole, and saw a radiance in creation, in the greening of the earth, the sprouting of seeds, blossoming of plants. She called this verdant fecundity viriditas, a greening of the planet that is infused with a spiritual principle and a healing potential that can bring about planetary attunement. Interestingly enough, she represents probably the earliest music that we have from the Christian era. We actually have examples of her musical writings. Then, of course, there's Saint Francis of Assisi, who also lived approximately in that kind of era, born 1181, died in 1226. St. Francis of Assisi spent much of his time preaching about animals, exhorting that all creatures are brothers and sisters under God. And now he's celebrated as the patron saint of ecologists. Throughout his youth, he served as a soldier, but after a conversion experience, he renounced his family wealth and devoted his life to God. Perhaps some of you are old enough to remember the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which was a very well done movie about St. Francis. And interestingly enough, the lady that played St. Clare became a nun and is still I think the abbess of her convent. All right, so why should we be interested in this idea of nature mysticism. Well, we spend probably a great majority of our time with our senses going outward. We might spend an hour or two, or if you're a really hardcore meditator, maybe 3 or more hours a day meditating. But most of us are in a category where maybe a half an hour twice a day or something of that nature. And so we spend most of our time having to deal with the external world. And so it's a great exercise to be able to begin to form the habit of seeing God in the external world. Now, of course, there are some dangers. You might forget the transcendent aspect of God if you get so involved and so enchanted with the beauty of nature and external things, then the senses can get a stronger hold on you and can be a greater distraction. But if you can be aware of that danger, I think it's a great value to begin to cultivate the discipline of seeing God in nature. Now we have two other examples of people that saw God in nature from American botanists. And they offer an interesting distinction between the two, because again, if you read a lot of this literature about nature mystics and panentheism and panpsychism and so forth and so on, you realize that some of the people that ascribe to those philosophies are deeply committed to a spiritual tradition, whether it be Hinduism or Christianity or some other major tradition. Others are not. They don't see a need to be in a particular religious tradition. Now, our first example is George Washington Carver. And he was a dedicated Christian, but he was very much attuned to nature. And he was a black gentleman who was one of the very first black people to get a PhD and to teach in college. So let me read you some quotes. He says, "Reading about nature is fine, but if a person walks in the woods and listens carefully, he can learn more than what is in books, for they speak with the voice of God." And speaking about his relationship with nature, he says, "If you love it enough, anything will talk with you." And he would go out in the twilight hours, both the evening and the morning, and commune with the plants to try to find out how to best use them and how to best cultivate them so that they would be of benefit to humanity. He says, "I love to think of nature as an unlimited broadcasting station through which God speaks to us every hour, if we only tune in." So I think that kind of is a good way of summing up the point of this talk, is we want to tune in to this ultimate broadcasting station of nature. When you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. Fear of something is at the root of hate for others, and hate within will eventually destroy the hater. Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. Not only have I found that when I talk to the little flower or to the little peanut, they will give up their secrets, but I have found that when I silently commune with people, they give up their secrets also, if you love them enough. So, in other words, we want to cultivate the habit of broadcasting a silent love towards all beings in the world. And this silent communication will get to them. All living things will be able to respond to this. He says, "No books ever go into my laboratory. The thing I am to do and the way and the way are revealed to me the moment I am inspired to create something new. Without God to draw aside the curtain, I would be helpless. Only alone can I draw close enough to God to discover his secrets. Human need is really a great spiritual vacuum which God seeks to fill. With one hand in the hand of a fellow man in need and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across the vacuum. In other words, you have a religious background and be helpful to your fellow man. He was an exemplar karma yogi. I think we're missing a wheel here or something.
You know what? No. Actually, let me help you.
Or is it just because of the carpet?
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Didn't want to disturb you. You can put it forward if you need to, Nelson.
Our Creator is the same and never changes, despite the names given him by people here and in all parts of the world. So here he's got an interfaith perspective, where he got that I have no idea. It wasn't being preached in the Baptist churches in those days. Even if we gave him no name at all, he would still be there, within us, waiting to give us a good on this earth. So you see, he saw God within and God without. Then, the second one is Luther Burbank. And he was a member of Self-Realization Fellowship. And if you read the Autobiography of a Yogi, you'll find a whole chapter on him in there. He called him his saint. But in spite of that, he didn't consider himself a card-carrying religious person in that sense. He was still going to be his own person and have his own faith and he used the techniques of meditation taught to him in his own way. So a couple of quotes from Luther Burbank, and interesting to see how he again emphasizes this idea of love in order to communicate with plants, just as George Washington Carver did. The secret of improved plant breeding, apart from scientific knowledge, is love. While I was conducting experiments to make spineless cacti, I often talked to the plants to create a vibration of love. "Oh, you have nothing to fear," I would tell them. You don't need your defensive thorns. I will protect you. Gradually, the useful plant of the desert emerged in a thornless variety. Intimate communion with nature, who unlocked to him many of her jealous and guarded secrets, had given Burbank a boundless spiritual reverence. Burbank says, "Sometimes I feel very close to the infinite power. Then I have been able to heal sick people around me as well as many ailing plants." The integrity of one's own mind is of infinitely more value than the adherence to any creed or system. We must choose between a dead faith belonging to the past and a living, growing, ever-advancing science belonging to the future. So you see, he saw the techniques of meditation as a science belonging to the future. And while not particularly adhering to any creed, he was going to use this science of the future to have a living faith of his own. Luther Burbank also said, "I have seen myself lose intolerance, narrowness, bigotry, complacence, pride, and a whole bushelful of other intellectual vices through my contact with nature and with other human beings. And when you take weeds out of a garden, it gives you room to grow flowers. So every time I lost a little self-satisfaction or arrogance, I could plant some broadness of love of my own in its place. And after a while, the garden of my mind began to bloom and be fragrant. And I found myself better equipped for my work and more useful to others as a consequence. So you can see that his, just as with George Washington Carver, his work with plants was something which nurtured his whole soul and gave him a very spiritual outlook on life. Now, what did I do with John Muir? I didn't lose him. I had lovely quotes from John Muir. There we go. If you've ever been to Northern California, you might have passed by or gone to Muir Woods. Muir Woods is a park that John Muir managed to get set aside as a nature preserve. And he was one of the premier proponents of setting aside parts of nature to leave them untouched so that people could enjoy nature in its original glory. So here's some quotes from him. "One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. There is not a fragment in all nature, for every relative fragment of one thing is a full harmonious unit in itself." It kind of reminds you of the butterfly effect, where the idea that all of nature is interconnected, and any little thing that's done anywhere in the entire globe has an effect which we might not realize in the whole scheme of things. "None of nature's landscapes are ugly so long as they are wild. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world." So again, it's this wholeness of nature that he emphasized. And there are many, many other quotes that he talked about how much he got by observing the mountains and observing the forests. He was especially fond of forests. He says that when wise men speak, people listen. When mountains speak, wise people listen. This also reminds me of an organization called Outward Bound. It was originally founded to help young people that needed to find a little bit more grounding, you could say, in getting away from city life and drugs and all sorts of bad influences that they might be having in city life, getting them out into nature. UCLA had a program called Unicamp, which did that as well. But the idea of this Outward Bound was to take people into nature and allow them to contemplate their own existence in nature, their connection with nature, and to try to find a deeper meaning and purpose in life. And this has now been expanded to adults, realizing that many adults begin to lose their way in this kind of economic world that we live in, when people get married and have families and obligations, and you have to get enough money to keep the house going and to support the other members of the family. Pretty soon the attention's all on work, money, and you begin to lose your spiritual moorings. And so they developed a subset of this Outward Bound for adults, where they could take a couple of weeks out and feel what it's like to depend on nature, to go out and simply be in situations where everything is not comfortable and where you have to adjust if there's a storm that comes and you have to find the water, you have to search for food and so forth. And so I've forgotten the name of the book, but there was a book that somebody wrote about his experiences and other people's experiences in this program and how it really transformed their life to have gone through this experience and to have a chance to get back to nature. So when we look at nature, we find a whole lot of really fascinating things, and we realize just how miraculous nature is. If you observe plants, you can observe how they respond to light. You know, if you plant a plant where it's not getting sufficient light, it will reach for where the light is. It knows where the light's coming from. If the watering system, suppose you're on a drip system and this emitter gets clogged, but this one's open, and it's gonna know where to send the roots. It's gonna send the roots over to where the water's coming out. Living things have a way of responding to nature. And we know again through evolution that plants and animals have evolved responding to changes in nature. There's the famous example of a type of moth, a spotted moth in England that came in many different varieties of spottedness, some with more black spots and some with fewer. So some of them were predominantly white, some of them were predominantly dark. But most of them were predominantly white because they tended to like to sit on the bark of like a white birch tree or something that had a white bark. Well, during the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, where they were burning a lot of coal, a lot of those trees started turning dark from the soot. And lo and behold, pretty soon the dark moths became more prevalent than the light moths because they were less apt to be eaten by predators. Then when the environmental movement stressed cleaning up the environment and getting rid of the dirty smokestacks and cleaning up the stuff from the smokestack so that it didn't pollute the environment so much, now the moths have reverted back to being predominantly white. So this is an evolution in a very short time scale that we've actually been able to observe. Now, we've also seen that people can communicate with plants. We've seen that Luther Burbank and George Washington Carver, through exuding a feeling of love and talking to the plants, they actually were able to get the kinds of secrets they needed in order to further their hybridizing programs. And of course, people that are animal trainers can also tell you that animals respond very well to training, and you can learn to communicate with animals. They've taught some primates to communicate with sign language, and they've taught them quite a few words with sign language. And we know that these animals are thinking, reasoning beings. And so that consciousness is in there. And where did the consciousness come from? It came from the same place our consciousness comes from. It's the same place that the plant consciousness comes from. And so all of this, everything is interconnected with that Satchitananda, that consciousness that's built into the entire system. Systems of healing, where you focus on healing the body. What are you doing? You're communicating with the consciousness that's in your cells, which is in the atoms in the cells. And people can modify their own health by the way they think. And so your own bodies respond to the way you think. There's some fascinating examples too of, there's a couple of cases of people that had multiple personality disorder. And in one personality, they would be allergic to, say, strawberries. And when they were exhibiting another personality, they could eat strawberries with impunity. And so their mindset of that personality was affecting the immune system cells in their bodies. And then, of course, we have examples like ants and bees and termites that live in colonies, and the incredible kind of way they have of communicating with each other. It's like there's one cosmic mind of each colony that knows what the rest of the members of the colony are doing. They can communicate with pheromones, or they might communicate by flapping wings or something of that nature. And so animals have all these ways of communicating with each other and responding. So there is a sentiency in all of these different organisms, and it manifests in a huge variety of ways in this universe. So as we keep in mind that this consciousness is all pervading, and this consciousness within us is connected to the consciousness in everything, we can realize that our meditation is affecting all beings, that the more people meditate and think high thoughts and holy thoughts, think of love and inclusiveness and expansion, the more that effect will take place. And so these are ideas which will hopefully be very helpful to us as we try to cultivate more and more spiritual thoughts throughout our entire day. Not just when we're meditating, but all the time. We can try to remember that there's consciousness in everything. And every time something falls on the floor, you can realize that all those atoms are conscious of all the other atoms in the earth. And that's why it's attracted down to the earth. And when something is attracted to a magnet, you stick one of those magnets up on your refrigerator. You know that the magnetic field is communicating with the magnetic fields in the atoms of the metal that you're toasting it on. So that concludes our talk. We'll end with a chant, and then we'll give an opportunity to offer some flowers. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamidachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace.